Hello, all. We're going to get started here. Good afternoon. I'm Ashley Wallace. I'm one of the Associate Directors in NCSL's Education Program. Thanks for joining us today. Since chronic absenteeism rates remain elevated after the pandemic, we did want to host this webinar today so that you all could dig into what exactly is chronic absenteeism, what are the implications for students, and also hear from our speakers about how some states are committing to reduce chronic absenteeism in a big way. At the end, there will be time for some Q&A. And if you don't see the Q&A box, there is a separate box for that. Go to More on your screen and select Q&A. Now to introduce our speakers, Hetty Chang is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works. We have Lynn Jennings. She's the founder and executive director of National and State Partnerships for Ed Trust. And Nat Malkus is a senior fellow and deputy director of education policy for American Enterprise Institute, AEI. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can turn it over to our speakers.
All right. Ashley, if you want to ask me the question, I'll answer. I think I've got my
You can
screen up.
multitask. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, we're going to start with Hetty. What is chronic absence and why does it matter?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much, Ashley, for inviting all three of us to join. It's such a pleasure to be here. And also, really appreciate all the interest from legislators who've joined the call today. This is such a critical issue. I'm going to start just briefly by defining terms because there are multiple attendance terms. And one of the things that we found have gotten people in trouble is we actually think we're talking about the same thing, and we're not because we mean slightly different things. Um, a lot of times people think about attendance as average daily attendance, especially because in a number of states, about six of them, we actually fund based on average daily attendance. I live in California, so we're one of those. Um, and that tells you largely how many kids show up every day. It's a school level measure. And it can tell you certain times of year when things are challenging, but it doesn't can actually mask individual kids who are missing so much school that they're at risk. The other way we think about attendance terms are truancy, and that actually is usually referring to unexcused absences. And what we mean by truancy, like what's an excused versus unexcused absence, how many absences make a kid truant, that actually can vary a lot by state. But overall, that's emphasizing compliance. You need to show up to school or else. And if you don't, typically it starts to invoke more legal, more blaming, more punitive solutions. And that's what we have had the longest history around of attendance and attendance metrics. And then there's this metric of chronic absence, which has only been in broad scale use since probably about 2018, 19. And that's missing 10% or more of all absences, including excused and unexcused absences and suspensions. It's looking at the impact of days and recognizing that when you show up to school, there are some real benefits. It's really trying to emphasize a preventive problem-solving approach and the fact that we need to engage with families and students to figure out what's going on. And we know that from a whole wealth of research now that when kids start typically chronically absent in pre-K first, second, third, it has all these effects on early literacy, on achievement, and it also has effects on kids' social emotional development. And not only that, but when large numbers of kids miss school, let's say about 20% of kids in a school, the impact actually is not just on those kids who are missing school, it's on everyone because it makes it harder for teachers to teach, kids to learn, kids to finish their classroom projects. And so there are actually ripple effects.
Thank you, Hetty. My next question is for Nat. What do we know about how chronic absence has changed during the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here to show some slides because I love to bring the data on these things. I started the Return to Learn tracker several years ago here at AEI to track what was going on in schools post-pandemic. And we tracked a number of things, but the one that we're focused on mostly now is chronic absenteeism. And what you see is a map Hetty shared that chronic absenteeism wasn't in as wide use until about 2018. You can see the states that published this district level data. And these dots, you can see the scale on the top. Pale is better attendance, and red, as you might imagine, not great. And in 2018, this map really fills out. And around 2018 and 2019, we had fairly stable chronic absenteeism. That's 15% of students. That may seem okay, but that's really about 1 in 6 or 7 students who miss 10% of the school year. In 2020, of course, it looks like it went down, but you can't trust this data because we were unable to take attendance effectively after the closures in March. And the following year, this was the year where many students learned from home for different parts and attendance was difficult, though you can see the color getting darker. In 2022 was when things really took on a whole new level of meaning. At this point, we had moved from about 15% chronic absenteeism pre-pandemic to about 28.5, 29% across the nation, nearly doubling. Now, it's important to note that this is 2023. This is not last year. It's the previous year. It's also important to note that we don't have data for every state out yet from that year. But at this point, we did have a lowering of the chronic absenteeism rate, but not by a whole lot. This is a visual the New York Times put up to illustrate this, and I think it's just a stark indication of the nature of the change. And it's important to remember that in this 2021-22 school year, this was the height, but this was also in many ways the height of the pandemic. This was the year of Omicron. So there's a lot of reasons to think, well, yeah, that's when we'd have the most absences. And I think this small decline in 2022 to 2023 of just a couple of points is really the thing that we are afraid of. You can see this in the state by state data as well. This is the 2018 data, 15%, and 2019 data. Look at how consistent those bars are. And then we jump to 2022, and you can see the dotted lines are the average, and it jumps really high up there. In 2023, in the orange, it goes down in most states, not all. But really the concern is that we've elevated to this new point and whether we can bring this down. A couple of additional things that I think are important are what kind of districts we see these changes. And it's really important to hold two things in your hand here. So the blue bars here are pre-pandemic chronic absenteeism. This is 2018. And the top two lines are the highest achieving districts. And you can see that chronic absenteeism was lower both before the pandemic in blue and after the pandemic in yellow. And the lowest achieving districts are at the bottom. So we can see that along a number of measures, which I'll show, just click through here in a minute, you can see that both pre and post pandemic, chronic absenteeism is worse in some of our disadvantaged districts. That is very important. It is also true that the percentage increase is very similar. So in high achieving districts, it about doubled. And in low achieving districts, it about doubled. So in the same way that you see this by achievement, you can see it by poverty, you can see it by urbanicity. You can even see differences by whether schools were mostly in person or mostly remote. You see some differences here, but that is not the main driver of this chronic absenteeism we're seeing. This is across the board a change that we are seeing. Very quickly, you can also see this by student race. This is from 2020 to 2022, but you see that Asian students pre and post pandemic had relatively lower chronic absenteeism. Black and Hispanic students relatively higher. White students a little bit somewhere in the middle. But when you look at the percentage increase, it's just astonishingly similar. So the change in kind is really even. The last thing I'll show is this is 22 rates. We have for 21 states right now rates from this is 23, and then the yellow is 2024. The good news here is that in most states in 2024, chronic absenteeism continued to decline. But the bad news is maybe not as fast as we need it to. You can see here in orange that some states had a big decline from 2022 to 2023. And in yellow, we can see that some other states had a big decline between 2023 and 2024. That's last year. But not many states have had, none other really than Rhode Island, had two drops of equal size that were large. The kind of chronic absenteeism change that we really want to see. So we're still definitely in the middle of this fight.
Thank you, Nat. I'm a visual learner, so those visuals were really impactful. Um, my next question's for Lynn. What are the implications for educational equity?
So I also want to thank you for having Ed Trust here today and just being able to join this conversation. So there are a few, and I think we've already begun to touch on them. Nat's in all his slides has touched on the rates, how much they've doubled. We saw during the pandemic and the slow decline we've seen. And we've often talked about this in terms of we want to make sure this doesn't become the new norm, these kind of numbers that we see in chronic absenteeism. But for an equity organization that, we fight for students who are from low-income backgrounds, Black and Brown students, students in communities that have historically been underserved or marginalized. The one point that we often make is that this challenge of chronic absenteeism isn't new to these communities and these student groups. And so although it's not new, it has gone up. It is something that we want to make sure that we pay a lot of attention to. Because what we know is from children from low income backgrounds, it was two to three times more likely to be chronic absence during this time. You'll see from this slide that we shows the increase that we see in students in color in terms of their chronic absenteeism rate. So if you can just imagine that if your baseline wasn't that great to start with, when you see the increase, what does it mean for all of these students, all these student groups, if we're not making sure this is a national priority, making sure it's an educational priority, and that we're zeroing in on the big picture because it affected all students, as well as getting down to what is happening with different groups and how it's affecting different student groups. What's not on this slide, I do also think it's worth, I want to make sure to note is that students with disabilities, also we saw a huge increase. They were disproportionately impacted when it comes to chronic absenteeism in terms of the rates that we see. Next slide. So given what I just said, it's important to keep in mind that this is something that has been a challenge and that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to and understanding it as an equity issue. It's also important to keep in mind that chronic absenteeism is often a warning sign, or it is a warning sign for how students are off track academically. Students who are not who are in the third grade and they're not reading on the grade level, they're more likely not to graduate from high school and pursue post-secondary educational opportunities. So this is why this has been an indicator of really what's happening to students in schools, what's happening in school buildings, what's happening in school districts, if we were to look at these rates, of what's happening with chronic absenteeism. This slide also shows that although we see that there's a drop, in terms of student proficiency by grade level in third grade for all student groups, that for Black and Hispanic students, you see how much of a drop there is there. And so what this shows for us and what this tells us is that these communities and students that in schools that have been historically underserved, that this is where we're going to see some of the greatest and has had the greatest impact and where we probably need the most resources, making sure that we're allocating resources because they didn't have them before the pandemic. and we're really concerned about what's going to happen to them as we're recovering from the pandemic. So what that means is, what does this look like for academic recovery? What kind of services are needed in these schools for these students who need to have learning recovery along with acceleration in their learning, as we talk about learning loss and things like that. So um, that's one thing we really want to keep important. We want to keep in the center of these conversations when we're talking about students who are still just not showing up for school, and what kind of strategies are we going to use to address these issues, and how these strategies might not look the same for all student groups.
Thank you, Lynn. My next question is actually for all of our speakers. Why have you all joined together to challenge states to reduce chronic absence by 50% in 5 years?
Yeah, I'll take a first cut at that. We have several reasons to list here, but look, we drew together, and I'll be straight with you. AEI is sort of right of center, and my friends at Ed Trust and I don't always share all the same attitudes on all the issues that we run into in the education space. But we have joined together on this one because it's so patently not a left-right issue. We want students who are enrolled in school to go to school and get the full benefit of it. And we see this as undeniably the number one problem that is facing schools today. Not that pandemic learning loss or the many other issues that we have in schools aren't large, but we think the solutions to those lie through fixing chronic absenteeism. So we did draw together to challenge states to join in this goal, which is to resolve to cut chronic absenteeism by 50% over 5 years from its height in 2022. And we have several reasons for that. One of the first reasons is we didn't want to set a goal that said, well, let's just reduce it because pre-pandemic chronic absenteeism levels were just fine. So it almost doubled during the pandemic, and we want states to resolve to get to an even better place than that. And so it's aspirational, but it's also plausible. When we focus on these changes, we can change behaviors, we can bring students back, and we know that we were doing this or very close to what our aspirations are just a few short years ago. So this is something that we know is doable because we used to do it. Another thing that is very near and dear to my heart is that this needs to be a clear and measurable target. Oftentimes in the education spaces, we have one thing that comes, and this is our drive, only to be replaced by another. Again, we think that this is not only the most important problem, but it's a challenging problem. It's going to take years to push us back there. But if we don't set a clear and ambitious target now, our worry is that we could get used to a new normal where a good proportion, maybe 20% of students are chronically absent. And we believe that we can't be comfortable with that. So we need a clear target to set state, district, and building level leadership, as well as community partners and families, with no questions about where we're headed. I think Hetty has some points, or is it Lynn? Lynn, do you want to take the next
I think
one?
I'm going to follow you
Thank you.
on this one. So another one reason why Ed Trust was so attracted to this target and thought it was good, or this goal, is that we have the clear target. It's our North Star, what we want to reach, but also understanding that states, communities have different contexts. The way you get there might be different. And again, this is what I brought up even in terms of the equity implications, what certain student groups you might have, what the community might have, might not have, that might be different, but we ultimately know where we're going and what we want to get to. So there was enough flexibility and enough ways to adapt this goal for states and even the districts to use it in order to get to 50% reduction in 5 years. Another thing that's really important that is tracked, it can be tracked. You want to see if you're making success. Are you reaching certain milestones? Are you getting towards your target? Are you making that progress towards success? Because if you're not, what kind of pivot do you need to make and make that kind of change? If it's working really well in certain areas, why might it not be working in other areas? Why is it not working for certain groups of students, et cetera? So having something that is trackable, so you can get to the goal was super important to us. And then also that trust, accountability is something we're always going to come back to because the accountability comes from not only being able to hold the systems accountable for what's happening, but also as a way of if you have the data, you're making sure it's transparent and it's out there, that communities, families, can hold the systems accountable for what's supposed to be happening, what's supposed to be served for students. So that was very important. And we see this very much, and I want to emphasize this point, is it's not just to say something isn't working or is broken, but how can communities, families be partners in terms of making this, getting and reaching this goal. So that's also what's accountable. Everybody can be held accountable to this goal. Passing it over to
So
Eddie.
I will follow up on that. I do want to just say one thing, and I think you all know this, but before, when I first started this work in 2006, very few states had any data. You also saw that on Nat's map. When I first started, it was like Maryland had some kind of data and then no one else. Now it exists on almost every state website. And that's partly what creates that public accountability that Lynn talked about, so that anyone who cares about this can drill down, look at their state, look at their district, look at their school. That kind of accountability is so important. And even if your chronic absence, was at 10 and now it went to 20, you can still get it back to 10. If it went from 25 to 50, you can still get it back to 25, so, and people can look at that, and you should make sure your websites easily do allow for that. It's when we make it publicly available that it also allows us to take a more comprehensive effort because everyone can get involved in seeing seeing it's an issue, and then offering their insights about what both are the barriers to getting to school and also what are some of the solutions. I also want to just emphasize we talked about this about something over 5 years because we know that over 5 years, that's a doable amount of time to put in place resources and supports and get outcomes. I also want to emphasize that we know with ESSA dollars going away that folks are going to have to be creative as you think about your resources, and that means thinking and planning over time. This is something, some of the disengagement that happened with kids isn't going to be solved over time. I mean, in one overnight. It's going to really require us thinking about how we do this over time. Back to you, Ashley.
Great. Thank you all. I'm going to put you on the spot again, Hetty. This next question's for you. How many states have signed on and what resources do they get?
All right. So right now we work together, and on September 9th, we issued a press release where we actually had 14 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Colorado, Connecticut, Iowa. You can see all of them. We were really pleased with this set of very diverse, regionally diverse politically states. Most of these states are states that have had some history of working on chronic absence. By the way, we don't want this to be an empty promise. We want it to be coming from states who are saying, I'm willing to put something in place so that I can get to this goal. What we're looking for is proof points that show that this is possible. And in fact, a number of these states are starting to get some real reductions. And then I will say we still are allowing for states to sign up if they'd like. DC is one of those that signed up, and that we have a couple that are considering this. We'll probably announce again sometime in January, February, who are some of the additional states who have signed on. One of the things that we produced was this roadmap, and I will let Attendance Works take the credit and blame for whatever is or isn't there on this roadmap. But we really wanted to give people a sense of how they could do this. So organize your team, agree upon your destination. We have this fun little data tool that allows you to look at where you want to be over 5 years. Which groups are you seeing progress in? Which groups are not having progress? Which districts? Which grades? Which student populations? So that you can think about how do you want to target your work. And then we're suggesting that folks want to really think about one of these 5 one or more, probably more in most cases, priority routes, family engagement, student connectedness, relevant and engaging learning, health, well-being, safety, and access to learning, and see how which of these routes, given what they have as assets, given what they know isn't in place, they might want to make as a priority to help get them to achieve this goal. Then you can use that to share with everyone where you're going. You can build capacity and partnership. You can then use your data to adapt, monitor, and adapt, and see where you're going over time. We are starting to do some convenings of key contacts in the states that joined, at least so we can create some peer learning. But I will just say for us as a group, we're both trying to create some opportunities for folks who are uh, already in the network to learn, but a lot of stuff is also publicly available on my website or on the Attendance Works website. If people want to download and think about this, I also know that we want to continue occasionally highlighting and sharing the stories of the bright spot states that are getting reductions so that others, whether you've joined or not, might want to consider being part of this. Um, and I don't know if Nat or Lynn would want to add anything else about what you see as a partnership offering for folks, given the kinds of resources that each of your organizations bring.
Well, I can just chip in briefly, Hetty. You know this all too well. I track data. I do it to make it transparent how uh, big a problem this chronic absenteeism and some other things are, and also to track progress over time. So I think that folks should certainly report their data. We can talk about that more. But one of the things that I will add on is the capacity for folks in your state to know how much progress your state is making. Whether that's not as much progress or fantastic progress that Hetty and Lynn and I can highlight and promote.
I don't think I have much to add. We'll probably talk more about it in terms of the partnerships part. That's really where Trust comes in with this work is how do you build partnerships of folks who are inside doing this work. Some are policymakers, school leaders, district leaders who are doing this work, state leaders who are doing this work, and what we can do as advocates to be partners in reaching this goal.
Great, thank you guys. Before I open it up for some Q&A, since the majority of folks on this webinar are either legislative staff or legislators, I'd like you all to give your perspective on what's the role of state legislators in this. I don't know who wants to start with that one.
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab at it. I think there's a couple of things that is important for state legislators to understand about this problem. And one, it isn't necessarily about what you should do, but why you should be aware of it. There are some folks who are very focused on education. That's their sort of bread and butter issues. I can identify with that. There's other folks who say, well, I understand that, but maybe the state legislature can't do too much. One of the factors that I think is important to motivate state legislators' interest in this is that chronic absenteeism is a tax. It is a tax on your citizenry. Let's just think about it in terms of what is in most states the largest expenditure from the state is on education and education supplements to districts. And we are now looking at a much larger percentage of students than we previously had that are missing a large portion of school that your state is spending. So that means that you're either likely getting less for what you are currently spending, or to get the same sort of output and production out of your students, the same amounts of learning, you're going to have to spend more. Either way, this works like a tax, and it's a tax that if we can turn it back, we can do better for students. So it really is something that we should think of as a sort of stewardship of public funds, also the means to make our school system as strong as possible. This is really something where it's not right and left, it's just good governance that we should want our students to get the most out of school. And if they're missing 10% or more of school, I'm telling you, They're not getting the most out of this public service. So I think it's a key thing. One other thing that I'll say about for state legislators is that education is in almost everyone's interest. I hope I've convinced those who may have not found it interesting that given that this is a tax, it should be. Um, but if you are focused on the education production in your state, then this is the issue that you should be focused on. If you want test scores to improve, if you want students' mental health to improve, if you want the effectiveness of your schools to improve, the path through for all those things to improve is through fixing chronic absenteeism. And the last thing that I will say before I yield the floor to my friends here is that there is an interest in not doing harm. I know there's a lot of folks who want to say, well, if they're not showing up to school, then we should get the DAs involved, or we should get truancy courts involved. We are certainly at the point now that there is just not enough space in the sort of heavy-handed systems that we may want to think could solve it. There's too many students in this problem to come at it from sort of a punitive lens. I know that Lynn and Hetty and I concur on that. I think there's a reasonable place for sort of school-based responses, but I think that the legislature, who's overeager to get at this, needs to be very careful about how they're going to push down on districts to intervene on this issue. So with that, I'll yield to Hetty or to Lynn.
I'm talking on mute, but I was gonna say I think you hit most of them. Um, so I'll yield it to Hetty right now because I think yeah, you hit everything I would have hit.
All right. Well, I will offer a couple things. One, actually, I want to reemphasize, you as a state legislator, you can make sure your state produces timely chronic absence reports for everyone to see. One of the things that Nat and Lynn and I often talk about is sometimes this data comes out so delayed. There were a group of states this year that started coming out, and I thought this was great in September and October. Because if you get this data from the end of last year, this is the 23-24 data in September, October, you could do something about it. If you don't get the data till March, and it's almost a year late, it's hard to take action. So as a state legislator, one thing, you should look for the data on your state. How often is it out there in an early enough time so someone can do something with it? And can you find it on your website? And if you can't, and your staff can't find it on your website because it's buried so hard, you might want to have a conversation with someone about how to make sure it's clear. Is it disaggregated? So you can see those inequities that Lynn's talking about. It. Can I find it by school? Can I find it by district? That issue of actionable, timely, easy to use public data, that's something that legislatures can always ask for and can push for. The other thing I wanted to say is I've seen legislators so appreciate Nat's comments about, the legal system should really, really, really only be used as a last resort, because otherwise you will drive all your judges totally crazy because they have so many kids they can't even do what is helpful. And in fact, if you start on that legal action too early, you may alienate families and kids before you can partner with them to really find out why kids are missing. But part of making sure that it's a last resort is you need to equip districts and schools to be able to partner with families, community groups, other agencies to take a prevention-oriented approach. And that equipping can take a number of forms. So some, and Connecticut, I'm going to give one example. They both required when you had a certain level of chronic absence, and I think Maine recently passed on this. A couple different states have done this. If chronic absence reaches a certain level, in Connecticut, it's 10% as a district or 15% in a school, you actually have to have a team in place, can be part of an existing team that actually sets about putting in place a prevention-oriented approach. They also required the state to produce guidance so that everyone could see And we have now a number of great guidance from a number of places. The other thing that states can do is they can allocate resources. So if you're investing in expanded learning programs, which can be used to connect kids and address barriers, maybe you use chronic absence as a allocation so that those places with higher levels of chronic absence actually get more resources to be able to address the issue. Um, Whether that's home visiting, expanded learning, other kinds of things that really could be investing. So, and then the last thing I would just say is I think you could also be calling for evaluations of programs to see which programs in your state actually are making a bigger difference so that as you put in place resources, you're making sure that you're using your resources wisely as possible. And I think we have people commenting now in the chat.
Ashley, if I could just add one more thing, since Hetty opened the door to it, as far as the legislator's particular role, is that a lot of the work on chronic absenteeism at the legislative level, there's been some updates, but in many states, these things, particularly around data, were done pre-pandemic. So, for instance, I won't call out the state, but I know that there's one state who set their ESSA target as your next year's target should be above your last year's target. Well, that may have worked pre-pandemic, but now we need our targets not just to beat our last year's, but to be rooted in a much bigger improvement because we had this great increase. There's also, as Hetty said, about some states will go into the spring and some all the way till August of the following year to release their chronic absenteeism data. Oftentimes, the state education agencies will say, well, that's when the law says that we're supposed to release it, so we just maintain that schedule because that is what it is in statute. So there are ways to pay attention to how quickly the SEA is required, and if that requirement is seen as a delaying opportunity to change that around to get that data out as soon as makes sense. Don't wait for chronic absenteeism to come out with all the test scores and all the other data in one package because both the public and legislators and parents and educators need to see that data as rapidly as possible. And anything that stalls that is going to sort of hobble that effort and also minimize how quickly people see, and early in the year, people see what they need to work on based on the previous year's achievement. So I can't say how important it is for legislators to know that they are using their weight to get the data out from their SEAs as rapidly as possible.
Thank you so much. I do see some questions. I'm going to look at the Q&A box here. We have a question, have there been any studies or resources about the root causes of chronic absenteeism, particularly for groups and communities let me see, particularly for groups and communities that are not new to the struggle.
So, Lynn, did you want to go ahead?
No, I was gonna say you could talk more about like a lot of the I'm sure get into the research that's out there on this, but I just wanted to start this off with thinking about we often think about this and how Ed Trust got into this issue is that as I mentioned before, a lot of the root causes, chronic absenteeism is a way of saying what are the root causes of certain inequities, what's happening to certain communities, what's happening to certain students. This is how we uncover in terms of when you have transportation issues, when you have issues like safety is often an issue. Is it something in terms of even how relevant is the curriculum? What's happening in the school? Inclusiveness becomes an issue, becomes issue. All these things are the things that start bubbling up and you start hearing about as you talk about chronic absenteeism. And key to that, and I wanted to come back to this, what we're saying about the data is really important. But what you do with the data is so important. So it goes into how you're going to get the resources to address an issue, but also what are you hearing from families and communities that you might say, well, it looks like this group of students are not coming to school. What's happening here? And you go and start talking to those families, start talking to those communities, really have some thoughtful engagement, and then you can start addressing those problems. And that's where we have learned it at Trust, is where we're hearing that this is an issue around transportation. This is an issue around what the culture, like I said, what's happening in the school. And so then you're able to actually target, have more intentional about the strategy for addressing it.
Um, I would add to what Lynn said. So it might, first of all, I think there's a lot of different studies. Most of them were pre-pandemic that tried to kind of figure out some aspects of why kids were missing school. But I also think one of the challenges of this is that there are big buckets. So barriers, aversion, disengagement, misconceptions is how we've organized the big root causes into something. And typically any root cause will fall into one of those things. The challenge is that exactly what the root cause is can vary depending on your community, your school, your district, sometimes individuals. So we need to know there are these big buckets. We also need to do a better job of finding out why kids miss school. And one of the missed opportunities we have, and I think this connects a little bit, for example, to Sunny Liu's comment about how are we tracking data, is we need to find a better way of saying when kids miss school, how do we start to indicate and find out what those challenges are? So um, for example, I'll just go to Connecticut again. They had this learner engagement and home attendance program where home visitors went out to kids who were chronically absent to find out what was going on. But when they went out to go visit, they had a system where the home visitors had to then mark down, well, this family experienced this challenge with transportation. This family experienced this challenge with health. This family experienced this challenge around getting access to, let's say, technology. Actually, New Mexico has also some pieces of this. And what we need to be able to do is then aggregate that data so that you can see patterns. I was just seeing David Epley's comment in Iowa, where you have an absenteeism law where people are required to go visit with every kid. And one of the challenges can be is while you need to find out from every kid what's going on, solutions might need to be programmatic. They're not always kid by kid. Let's say you have a bunch of kids who are all facing a problem with getting to school in a neighborhood because the pathway isn't safe. You don't want to address that kid by kid by kid. You want to think about, well, how do I create a safe path for a whole group of kids? Or in Providence, Rhode Island, this was years ago, I remember a bunch of kids, when they talked to families, they realized that the parents were working the night shift and couldn't, they were falling asleep before they could get their kids to school. So the solution was in making sure you had a school breakfast club that parents could drop their kids off before they fell asleep after working the night shift. So how do you both know what the barriers and challenges are? And then how do you understand when you actually need programmatic or policy solutions so that that we can address issues at scale? Because we got a lot of kids who are chronically absent right now.
I would just add, I mean, we haven't completed this yet, but one of the things I know our research team is looking into is also in terms of the ESSER dollars that we're saying, they're about to run out, how that money was invested in some of the programs that worked really well and what needs to be sustained in states, and this is when we talk about bright spots, things that are working and we need to continue. And you might have it also in your state of things that didn't work as well. Why didn't it work as well? Or do you need to scrap it? Does he need to do something else? So that's just a question that is definitely something we're asking here at Trust and thinking about in terms of different states. And I was looking at Sunny's comment too, and this was particularly something that some of our friends at like Schoolhouse Connection are taking a look at when it comes to students who are experiencing homelessness. You know, how were the dollars spent and what seemed to work when it came to really being able to target to students who have experienced homelessness, what worked for them and what didn't, and what issues came up that perhaps weren't even on the radar.
Great, thank you. Sunny, do you feel like that answered your question? I also just wanted to note in the chat box, David Epley, Sepher from Iowa, mentioned that they passed an absentee law with the group of parent, teachers, and principals to address kids' absences. It's turned out to be very labor-intensive effort. The law, he says, is also too tight with no excuse for funeral and leaves district decide things like a legitimate medical excuse. District that there's at least one district that he knows of that does not include a mental therapist as medical appointment. And I think that makes a good point. I don't know if this is Hetty, if you want to just comment on finding that balance between accountability and very strict language.
Well, I think there are a number of things tied up in what happened in Iowa. I do think it's a good idea for schools to have teams, but sometimes, and it feels like the Iowa legislation might have focused particularly on having schools meet just to solve individual kid cases. And when I think about wanting to have a team in place at a school, you want a team that's looking at your data and looking for how do they put in place a system of supports. So one thing is and they both need to, you got to think about how do you help individual kids, but a system of supports. And a lot of times when they get too prescriptive about when and how to help every single kid, that's when it gets really onerous. Um, Typically, I've seen better legislation where it's saying you need to have a team that's looking at your data, ensuring there's support and ensuring there's a prevention-oriented approach. So that's one piece I think that's in David's question. But the second issue is the issue of excused versus unexcused absences. Um, I think there's a lot more work to be done about how we work, how we think about that issue. So one of the challenges we've seen is that when absences are unexcused, we often don't track reasons for why the kid might miss. We only have reasons when the kids are excused. And it also can be really arbitrary what makes for an excused versus unexcused absence. Let's say you have two kids sick. They both were sick, but one doesn't have access to health care and doesn't have a doctor. So they don't come in with a doctor's note, and their absences ended up unexcused, even though in reality, both kids were sick because of health-related issues. I think we actually have to rethink our system so that we are much more careful about noticing when kids miss school and focusing on why they were missing. And we have to be very careful to only use unexcused if we absolutely know that a kid, was willfully missing school, which sometimes happens, but many absences aren't caused by that. And then when we treat them in a punitive way, maybe that, because often unexcused absences, teachers don't even have to help the kid make up for the lost homework. We already start to push families away when in fact we need to be partnering with them. So I think there are two kinds of issues that I think David's comment was actually reaching. And I'm going to put research that we did looking at some of the challenges around excused versus unexcused absences, that a report that we did here in California.
One thing just to add on to the excused versus unexcused debate, I think it's very murky. If you look at different states, you see very different patterns between states on what's excused and unexcused. And I agree, Hetty, that the data is not apples to apples from one district to another. But one thing that is fascinating about this is oftentimes you have folks who want to say, oh, well, it's the truancy, or oh, it's the sickness, or oh, the chronic absenteeism is, and they have a story that makes sense to them, and I get that. What we see when we look at, again, not the level of excused versus unexcused, but when you look at the pre-pandemic data on the proportion of unexcused versus excused pre and post-pandemic, it's remarkably similar. So to me, that doesn't say, oh, well, it's a problem with one or the other. It suggests that we're seeing a lot more absences. We know that's true because the chronic absenteeism is higher. But for those that are saying, oh, well, it must be truancy. Truancy is the problem we need to hit on. Actually, excused absences are also up. And for those who say, well, it's probably not the truancy, the unexcused absences look very similar in a proportional way. So I don't think it's one thing, and I think it's very important as state legislatures to understand this is not one thing. And if we just, hit that one thing that seems to make the most sense to us, that we're likely to get it. And I actually don't think that the one thing that might be the biggest explainer in one place is necessarily going to be the biggest explainer in the other. I do know from the data that we see broad-based increases over the pandemic. And so we need to think about this, as Hetty said, as a solution at scale. One thing that you usually don't hear about somebody from the bully pulpit is that it can do well on this. But I do think that the bully pulpit and leadership at the state level is important because we can put people on notice that this is important to bring now. It really does take an all hands on deck approach. That's not a saying. That is true. We need to get students and parents. We need to get teachers and principals, as well as district and state leaders, sort of all putting their shoulder to this because the problem is so widespread and large. So I think it's important to just keep an eye on how massive this shift has been.
Ashley, I was noticing, sorry, Edgar, I saw your question A at the Q&A and then you took it off, but I actually thought it was still relevant. So I wanted to bring it back up. Edgar Cabral asked about, sometimes we focus a lot more on in-school stuff, and how do we think about the issues and challenges that are beyond schools? And Edgar, please feel free to unmute or add to that if you'd like. But I actually think that's a worthwhile conversation for us to have a little bit more. Um,
Yeah, Hetty, sorry. Yeah, I started typing that in, and then you all went to the question of what's the role of state legislators? Yeah, I think my question, a lot of when I look at some of the best practice and having, I'm from California, and so I've seen you come and testify in a variety of hearings. A lot of the best practices are like, here's what the schools can do, here's what districts can do. But at the state, because we are not often kind of involved in some of those specific issues, it's hard to unless we're getting very micromanaging, which is not typical, to require certain things like that. But then, yeah, a lot of these issues are broader than what's going on at the school. And I think this is a question that I have that I think others have too, is sort of like, is there a fundamental change now post-COVID in terms of the issues that families are going through um, that we can better support? Or are there things that just, the reaction, the more likely, we are much more likely to just, or families are just more likely to have students be absent. But anyways, I don't know if that's part of where you were
yeah,
going.
yeah, no, Edgar, I think that's really helpful. And I might offer, I think there's a couple things. One is, I think legislators, one role you can do is actually convening people to kind of think about and unpack what are the barriers that kids and families and make that more public. But also what I'm hearing are a couple things, three things I would not think about. One is we hear a ton more about people still feeling huge lack of clarity about when to keep their kids home due to illness and when to keep them, send them to school. And we also know that there are a lot of families that still lack access to preventive health care. So I think how do you really, health-related absences are a huge piece, or fears of health. The other thing that's connected to that is mental health and anxiety issues. And so I think how we knit together schools with health-related and mental health-related supports, and how do we make sure those are culturally, linguistically appropriate and connected to communities? So we're dealing with lack of access to healthcare and preventive healthcare, both physical and mental and dental, is a huge place that I think most states can find could have a lot of impact. And that does require working outside schools. It requires working with your public health departments, requires, working sometimes with your hospitals. And then the other thing I would say, and you know this also from California, Edgar, is community schools have really been proven as a pretty effective solution for reducing chronic absence. And I think states have found that when they can make investments, but then we also have to make sure those community schools efforts are really using chronic absence to help guide how they allocate their resources and assess their effectiveness.
Uh, Martine, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. It might be a little far out, but I am in Vermont and we are in the midst of a housing crisis. And I'm wondering if you've seen any districts across the country that are at least attempting to provide some form of housing to students, maybe on a temporary basis, not permanent, but it does cross my mind every once in a while that we have a large number of homeless students right now, and if we could just provide even temporary housing, it could be helpful. Any thoughts?
Um, I don't know if you saw the latest LPI report on community schools. And one of the examples they gave, and because I live in San Francisco and I know how high, extraordinarily high the cost of housing is, that particular one of the strategies is they used part of the school to house families temporarily. Don't know if I've known of any districts and it didn't, but I think this interesting question. And we do, I mean, I know folks are challenged with enrollment issues, right? We're having declining enrollment. Some of that is post-COVID stuff. Some of that is also um, because of lower birth rates, right? What do we do with our school facilities? And I think it's an interesting question, but I don't know. It might be Schoolhouse Connection. We work with them. We're trying to document it stuff, but I think that's a really interesting question if anyone is exploring how schools can sometimes provide some temporary housing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
I think we're almost out of time here. Um, but a big thank you to our speakers today. And just a couple of notes here about other things coming down the pike for NCSL. We have just next week, we have our 2-day virtual convening called Base Camp. You can find out more information at ncsl.org. On November 4th, our elections team will have a pre-election webinar. That's one I never miss. They're going to talk about some key races and ballot initiatives. The link to watch that will pop in the chat. And I know there was a question about some of the legislation that was mentioned, particularly in Iowa. I know New Mexico talked some about their approach. We have a tracker, and there is, as you can see, it's a Power BI tracker. There's a lot of tags. There's under student supports, there's an absentee attendance tab. So I encourage you to check that out. We'll put that link in the chat box. Just a couple other ways to stay connected with us. And there's my contact information if you want to follow up. We will be posting we're recording. We're going to edit out some of the Q&A for privacy reasons. But big thank you to our speakers, and thank you for your engagement today.